Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for attending the third installment of our series Amid a Pandemic, 1521 to 2021. My name is Rachel Strawn Navarro, and I'm one of two academic coordinators at the Art, Design, and Architecture Museum at the University of California, Santa Barbara. So I'd like to begin with the Art, Design, and Architecture Museum acknowledges and honors the coastal Chumash people, the traditional custodians of the land where UCSB now stands. We pay our respects to the Chumash elders, past, present, and future, for they hold the memories, the traditions, and the culture of this area, which has become a place of learning for people from all over the world. And this lecture series was developed to supplement an exhibition to be hosted by the museum titled Amid a Pandemic After the War, 500 Years Later, featuring work by artist Sandy Rodriguez. The title refers to the time we find ourselves in now, 500 years after the Aztecs, in their own words, laid down their shields following 2 years of massacres, a smallpox epidemic, political betrayal and manipulation, and a 2-month siege of Tenochtitlan by Spanish invaders. The impacts of this invasion still reverberate throughout the Americas. And to introduce our guest today, Dr. Gerardo Aldana was appointed Dean of the UCSB College of Creative Studies in July 2020, and is also a professor in the Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies and the Department of Anthropology. Dean Aldana holds a BS in Mechanical Engineering from UC Berkeley, an MS in Mechanical Engineering from UC Irvine, and an AM and a Ph.D. in the History of Science from Harvard University. And that's an eclectic background that I myself relate well to. His research focus includes the histories and philosophies of indigenous Mayan sciences, both ancient and contemporary. And Dean Aldana's forthcoming book, Calculating Brilliance, An Intellectual History of Mayan Astronomy at Chichen Itza, weaves together archaeology, mathematics, history, and astronomy to bring different intellectual threads together across time and space, from classic to the post-classic, the colonial period to the 21st century, to offer a new vision for understanding Mayan astronomy. The book will be published by the University of Arizona Press later this year. So with that, I will hand the screen over to Gerardo. If you have any questions during the lecture, please feel free to type them into the Q&A section or hold on to them till the end, and we will try to save a little bit of time for discussion. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I really appreciate the invitation, the introduction, and again, I very much appreciate the fact that people are spending some time with us today. Given that, one, there are so many Zoom events that are available, and two, we've all spent so much time on Zoom, it's kind of a challenge to get on yet another meeting. And so I do appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts with you. Thanks also for mentioning my book. I'll point out that this talk today has really not a lot to do with the content of that. I generally do work on Mayan astronomy, on Mesoamerican sciences. Today, I'm much more interested in thinking about the bigger picture when it comes to intellectual trajectories. And so I was hoping to ponder a bit and hoping that you'll join me in more of a thoughtful experiment, considering the costs of conquest in terms of intellectual trajectories. And so I kind of want to start with a bit of an example. If we jump right into just the idea of what happens if you Google the ancient Maya. And there's no real surprises for anybody familiar with ancient Mesoamerica. You seem to always find the same themes recurring. It's almost as though we've always already known the ancient Maya in modern contemporary United Statesian society. We're always looking at how they're mysterious or how they're exotic, about their collapse or the warfare that overtook their civilization. Even when we find new insights coming from the application of LIDAR or new chemical analyses, we still end up seeing the same storylines around our representations of the ancient Maya. And so part of my question is why that occurs. To what degree can we get outside of these frameworks, these rubrics, these categories of thought that constrain our understanding of an ancient people? And to what degree is it an element of our methods, our scientific approaches, or can it potentially be a failure of our imagination? Is it that we are not allowing ourselves to get outside of the constraints of our common sense, of our comfort zones within a Western perspective, to be able to imagine something beyond the traditional interpretations? And I find this to be a critical issue. It seems even more compelling these days, just because I feel like we have really confronted this failure of imagination in our society. It seems that we've reached a point at which we're beginning to concede that the forms of inhumanity that we're seeing regularly in this culture are accepted. And it shouldn't be required at this point for us to say that, yes, indeed, Black Lives Matter, that what happened to Ronald Green or Breonna Taylor or George Floyd, those should be inconceivable to us. Those should exist, if at all, in the realm of imagination, not in real life. And so this is not simply an inquiry into what's happening in our attempt to represent ancient Mesoamerica. It has also to do with the various categories of thought that we deal with on a daily basis and that find presence in our interactions, in our communications. And so what I'm hoping to do today is really consider what I'm conceptualizing as two interruptions. Interruptions in intellectual trajectories. And to get at what I mean by that, I'll go back and I'll give you an example from some work that I did not too long ago. This was at the invitation of a colleague of mine in comparative literature here, Professor Dominique Julien. She was putting together this volume and a conference on the notion of foundational texts across cultures, across civilizations, across time and space, and was asking me to contemplate the possibility that we might find them in ancient Mesoamerica. This led me on an exciting but very unconventional for me investigation into, started off as just a hieroglyphic phrase. There's this text from Palenque, Temple 19, and it had only recently been found at this point and deciphered. And so in trying to contextualize this phrase, this text that seemed to be speaking of a cosmic creation event, I was hoping to find out what it meant on a broader religious scale within ancient Mesoamerica. And what I seem to be finding is that there were themes here that had been rendered opaque by the very process of how they were being interpreted and recorded. So the fact that a Mesoamerican spirituality was built on a close connection conceptually to blood, to female fertility, to orality and performance, these things that were not readily recordable or interpretable by the 16th century Spaniards, priests, conquistadores, who were preserving knowledge from that time period. Their own biases, their own perspectives prevented a number of concepts from continuing over time within their communities or making it into other forms of archives that could then be picked up by subsequent generations. And so that to me suggested that there are these biases, these filters that come into place just because of who's doing the interpretation, in what form, at what time, that then interrupt trajectories of thought. If you're interested in this, the rest of this story, it is in a chapter in Professor Julien's book. But what I wanted to do today was take that notion of an interruption and move it over to consider agriculture in ancient Mesoamerica, agriculture and the labor associated with it. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go and we're going to look at a bunch of stuff that is probably familiar to you if you've looked at ancient Mesoamerica at all. We're going to the classic Maya site of Palenque. It's in the current state of Chiapas in southern Mexico. See it, it's easy to Google. If you go to Google Maps, the site looks a bit like this from what's called the Temple of the Cross. So if you're standing at the very top of the Temple of the Cross and looking down onto the Tabasco Plain, you see the tower within the palace structure here on the right. Just across the way from that is the Temple of Inscriptions. We'll be looking at some of these structures and stuff within them shortly. And then over here, where we're kind of positioned, the perspective is from the Temple of the Cross. Across the plaza from the Temple of the Cross is the Temple of the Sun, and then adjacent to that is the Temple of the Foliated Cross. And it's that group of structures that we're going to be having a look at. So if we pull them up, we'll see this is what you would have been standing on to get that last image. Temple of the Cross, this is the Temple of the Sun, and this is the Temple of the Foliated Cross. And each of them was built by the same patron, by the same kuhulahau, what's often translated as ruler. They were all prepared for the same event, and they had the same architecture within them. They're built so that you would have the stairway leading up to the front. It's kind of eroded, it's broken away in this structure, but you would get to this front antechamber, which would lead you to a back chamber. And within that, there's an inner sanctum down below. And what we're going to be looking at are the tablets on the back wall of this inner sanctum. This is the one in the Temple of the Cross. There's the actual photograph of the actual carving. It's a little bit difficult to get at all the iconography in this form. So what we can do is we can appeal to these beautiful illustrations that were made by the artist and art historian, Linda Sheely, who generated an incredible archive of illustrations of Mayan art. And you can find all of them on the FAMC website. Feel free to contact me if you don't know what that is. This is the one that we were just looking at, what's called the tablet in the Temple of the Cross. The one below it is the tablet of the Temple of the Foliated Cross, and this is what they refer to as the Temple of the Sun. What I wanted to point out is that this is kind of at the heart of the elite portion of Palenque, the city itself, yet right in the center of it, we find a representation of maize and even a reference to agriculture. And so one of the questions that I think is interesting here is, how do we unpack this representation of agriculture in this elite and ruler setting? The reason I raise it is that I'm worried about a very specific type of interpretation, and that we see by looking at another tablet from Palenque. This is called the oval tablet. Within it, now that we can read the hieroglyphic text, we see that this is actually the father of the figure who was in the other tablet. That was Kinich Kanbalam. This is Kinich Hanap Bakal. And what we have to be worried about is the kind of thing that Jean Frederick Waldeck did in attempting to illustrate this oval tablet when he made his rendition in the 19th century. And that is that he was basically looking at this image, but representing it according to his understanding of classical art, which means Greek, Roman influences. And so he's reading something from the past, but it's being filtered by his own preconceptions. And that's the kind of thing that we want to avoid if we're trying to get at what is happening with agriculture in ancient Mesoamerica. So we're keeping that in mind, but we're going to push forward. How is that we understand something about agriculture and how it's represented here? Well, we can start by looking at the iconography. First, I'll mention, yes, that here's the name, Kinich Kanbalam, of the figure who we see on both sides. This is a well-interpreted image. You can find it actually in the first book that I wrote, but there's also representations of it in a lot of the works by Lynn Sheely and others, Peter Matthews. So I'm not giving you anything here that is brand new, earth-shattering. It should be the traditional interpretation at first. And what we see is we'll first kind of like fade out the writing because we're not going to focus on that. We want to highlight the iconography that's referring to agriculture. And so what we'll find at the bottom here is that this is a representation of wheats or an animated mountain. And this mountain is covered with foliage, with representations of agricultural fertility. You can see these kind of scrolly plant leaves show up not just on this mountain. Here's the face of it, it's animated. Here's the eyes. It's got the square pupils, the nose, the mouth below it. It's wearing these ear ornaments on either side. You also see these plant things on this mound that Kanbalam is standing on. So they're coming off of this wheat's structure. And they're even coming out of the hand of this figure who's popping out of a jute shell. So here there's some vegetation that's coming out, and you can see a face in that. And we'll get to that in a second. We can go further to say that, oh, look at As a matter of fact, this isn't just looking like a fertile mountain, it's actually labeled as such. This symbol in the forehead of the mountain is what we call the Kan cross, and Kan is a representation of fertility and things that are precious. And so they're telling us here, this is a precious mountain upon which stuff happens. What's the stuff that happens? That's where we see essentially an animated, a personified corn stalk. So here's the stalk in the middle. It's got these faces all over it that are giving it this life, or giving it this sense of power, of ku, term we'll get to in a minute. More so, we see that it's giving us a representation relative to humanity. The corn ears are replaced with heads, human faces. They're telling us something about the relationship between humanity and corn, which is ideological. It's also metaphorical, and hopefully it'll tell us something about politics as well as we unpack these themes. But the point that I want to get to is that here we are at this incredible set of structures, the elite portion of the site, and we're finding a rich representation of maize agriculture within it, and Kanbalam engaged in some kind of activity relative to it. So we might wonder if that's simply a one-off. Is it just that, okay, Kanbalam had something in his own personal background that made him want to represent maize within his elite inner sanctum of his temple, or is it broader than that? And of course, we find that it shows up in a lot of other places. It shows up in the representation of his father's own death. So this is the sarcophagus lid for Hanab Pakal, again, the father of Kinij Kanbalam. Again, we can appeal to Linda Shealy's drawing of it to get a little more of the detail. And what we find is that here, Hanab Pakal is represented after his death, but he's represented as being reborn, and he's wearing the clothing of the maize god, of deified maize. He's coming out of the underworld. These are these skeletal jaws that represent the underworld, that represent the interior of the earth. He's arising out of it, and then you can see kind of rising up behind him is the tree from the tablet of the cross, and a representation of the celestial realm sitting atop it. So we have essentially representation of the cosmos, of the underworld, of agriculture in the middle world, and then the celestial realm, with the deceased ruler mediating between them. This is telling us that in this position and wearing the maize garb, agriculture probably does have a little more to do than simply be than simply serve as a fetish of Kanbalam himself, one single ruler. And when we get to these other representations, here is yet another representation of maize. It comes from a pot. The form is called kib. It's a cylindrical cup. These photographs that I'm going to be showing you come from the work of Justin Kerr, who was a photographer in New York, and he developed a method back in the day when we still used film to capture these images and roll out what otherwise is wrapped around a cylindrical cup. In this case, we have a representation down at the bottom of, again, these skeletal jaws. The maize god here, you can see kind of in his headdress, there's a representation of a corn kernel. This is the maize god being reborn. In mythological texts, we find that after he's born, he's then carried by the paddler gods. This is the jaguar and the stingray paddler. They're carrying him to a place where he will then be ritually dressed by women who tend to him as he takes on his new role as the maize god. So we're seeing maize, potentially agriculture, taking on much broader roles than simply, again, imagery in one temple. Again, extremely well known, this yet another vessel from classic Maya times, in which we see the earth symbolized by a turtle carapace. And then out of that turtle carapace arises the maize god, tended to by his sons here named Yashbalamahau and Hunahau. Some cases they've been compared to the Hirotans from the Popol Vuh. Again, it takes us back to the newer finds by Bill Saturno at San Bartolo, and the incredible reconstruction by the artist Heather Hurst of these images, showing us again the centrality of maize if we kind of blow that central figure up, we see this is a deified maize entity, again, being tended to by these figures at the time of creation. This is no surprise, again, because if we go back to the Popol Vuh, which is a document from the 16th century, written in the alphabetic script, but in Quiché Maya, then we find that there are stories of the creation of humans. There are multiple creations. The creation of the humans who then populate the earth are made with corn itself. And this always makes me think of making tamales. Those of you who do engage in this practice, maybe around Christmas time, know that as you work with corn masa, it starts to feel as though it is part of your skin. And so there's this rich kind of embodied experience of corn and flesh that comes through an everyday experience, but is also recorded within mythological texts, kind of giving us the origins of humanity. All to say that agriculture is looking pretty darn important when it comes to both Mesoamerican religion and potentially politics. Another short excursion, these are a couple more pots from Justin Kerr's collection. Here we find representations of rulers, kuhulahaus, but they're wearing the attire of the maize god, and they're performing the same kind of dance. And this happens over and over again across contexts. This is maybe a little clear. We see two representations of figures wearing the same skirt, similar headdresses, now with these huge back racks. And Stephen Howson has made a really interesting observation that the back racks that correlate to the form of maize may be connected to the specific dynasties of the major cities within the classic Maya times. So that, for example, there's one maize deity with one patron that's affiliated with the rulership at Tikal. There's another one at Palenque, another one at Copan. And so each dynasty may have had its own corn patron, which leads to a lot of potentially interesting hypotheses. What I'm trying to get at here is then that we may want to stop before we think of agriculture in ancient Mesoamerica, or at least in the ancient Maya times, as being similar to the kinds of relationships that were constructed between agriculture and cities, towns, authority within medieval Europe, or even modern forms of agriculture. We might not want to see the bucolic settings of the pasture land and the humble farmers at one extreme and rulers at the opposite extreme, but maybe look for a different way of connecting them. So what does that mean? Well, let's look at agriculture. Let's see what the archaeological record tells us about agriculture and how it was practiced. And the first thing that folks usually get to is they think about the milpa cycle. They think about the slash and burn technology, where farmers today practice this in Mesoamerica. You'll go to a site, you'll chop down the trees and the weeds and the brush, and you burn it all, and that provides a fertile soil for you to plant in. You raise your crops there for a couple of seasons, but at some point the soil gets depleted, so you abandon it, you allow it to go fallow, you move to another region, and you start the process all over again. The whole thing becomes a cycle because over larger periods of time, you can reuse the same spaces. That milpa cycle though, although it's documented in texts from the colonial period, and we see it practiced today, is not the only form of agriculture that was practiced in ancient times. We know from our own colleague here, Annabelle Ford at the Mesoamerican Research Center, that there are innovative ways that we can understand Mayan agriculture as a forest garden, not just slash and burn, but looking for symbiotic ways in which staples can be grown within a forest environment. If we go to the work of Arlen Chase at Caracol, we see that there's very great evidence now that they use LiDAR to strip away the foliage for terracing. So the terraced fields that go all the way up to the very structures themselves, terraced fields that would have been populated with not just corn, but also trees and other corn, beans, and squash, the whole kind of litany of agricultural products. So terracing was another practice. Raised fields within the Maya region are now turning up. And again, we're finding these thanks to things like satellite technology and LiDAR technology. We're seeing that there are ways of producing intensive agriculture so that we're not reliant on a seasonal, annual agricultural produce, but we're actually doing this intensively so that there are multiple harvests per year, that you're able to actually feed a huge population on the amount of food that you're generating through this intensive agriculture, something much more complex than just the milpa cycle in which folks are feeding their own families. And so what I'm suggesting is that when we think of something like a practice that's far more familiar to us, the Aztec chinampas, or what Bernal Diaz del Castillo called the floating gardens, right? That this is probably not an anomaly for ancient Mesoamerican agricultural practices. And we should probably be thinking of them as within a spectrum of agricultural practices that would have been much more complex than simply slash and burn, and that would have required this different kind of attention from political authority, from political leadership, and perhaps the kuhulahau, him or herself. So what I'm hoping that we'll then see is that there's an option or an opportunity for an interruption in the kind of interpretation that has us seeing agriculture as something distant from authority, and potentially releasing us from the kind of interpretation that Waldeck had of his inscription, and moving us into a different space for seeing what agriculture may have been. On the other hand, it leads us to have to struggle with a couple of concepts that are almost central and potentially even a Foucauldian statement within modern and European, what I refer to as circum-Mediterranean derivative cultures and civilization. And that is that we have to break free from a conceptualization that has us thinking of agricultural labor as connected to menial and labor of lesser value, right? If we go all the way back to Aristotle and we think about how he conceptualized slavery, a lot of it had to do with the need for labor that could make forms of life like his possible. The dependence on slave labor for agricultural needs then put into place a type of hierarchy of lifestyles in which his elite kind of experience was the better version of life, and the lower version was the one of people doing manual labor out in the fields. And what it does is it doesn't just set up a conceptualization of agricultural labor, it also tells us something about our role here in the academy, and how it's possible that we can do the things that we do relative to the forms of labor that other people are engaged in. Is it that at some conceptual level, the academy itself is dependent on this hegemonic relationship between our labor and the labor of others working in the fields? What that does is it forces us to think about knowledge production itself. Where does it come from? And how do we engage it, especially here in the academy? And so what I want to do here is a quick digression on some thoughts about how we can access something that gets outside of hegemonic knowledge production. Now, I want to be careful. I don't want to say hegemonic equals bad. I don't want to say hegemonic equals oppressive. What I'm suggesting is that when we think of hegemonic knowledge production, we're thinking of that knowledge that is produced to preserve the institution that it's a part of, right? So we can take the extreme and think about something like Sylvanus Morley, the archaeologist from the early 20th century, who spent a lot of time excavating in the Maya region. But he also spent a lot of time as an officer for naval intelligence. So what he was doing was actually traveling in service of foreign affairs, in service of national interests. But at the same time, he was producing knowledge that became part of the canon of the interpretation of Mayan archaeology and Mayan civilization. That's a sense in which knowledge production is, at least tangentially, in the service of the institution of government. We can also think about hegemonic knowledge production in the sense of something like the NSF, right? The NSF has us doing basic science, but doing that in ways that require us to demonstrate the benefit to society for our research. So when we think about doing research on ancient Maya climate change, it's not just to understand what they were confronting, it's also because we hope to learn something from it. And so there's a way in which that work isn't free of influence. There has to be some product that is valuable to society as a whole, and that includes it within this realm of hegemonic knowledge production. So what I'm trying to say is that there's a whole scale of possible activity that fits within hegemonic knowledge production, and it's not a priori bad, but we do have to recognize the influences that go within it. And then, of course, if we're thinking about hegemonic knowledge production, we have to consider counter-hegemonic knowledge production. And here, I don't want to oversimplify this. I don't want to say that this is always in opposition to hegemonic. It can be the type of counter-hegemonic that is simply attempting reform. When anthropology, for example, hit a crisis in terms of what was it representing and why was it representing other cultures in the first place, it attempted a reform of itself. Postmodernity, post-structuralism came into anthropology to find ways in which it could still produce meaningful knowledge, but not do it in ways that were only in service of the hegemon. And so counter-hegemonic knowledge production sits in dialogue with hegemonic. It doesn't have to be destructive or radically oppositional. It can simply be reformative. But what it does is it sets up the possibility for a third form of knowledge production, which is what I'm really interested in, which is ahegemonic knowledge production. This is the kind of knowledge production that does not care about a relationship with the hegemon. It exists within its community, for its people, on its own terms. And here, I hope you're hearing at least echoes of the work of Linda Tuhiwai-Smith and Langston Hughes when we're conceptualizing these different forms of knowledge production related to hegemony. And of course, we can't oversimplify it to suggest that they are actually independent, because knowledge is produced by humans and humans are connected in multiple ways. There's got to be some overlap in any given case. So we're not completely devoid of reality, but we are trying to get at something that makes these different forms of knowledge production characterizable. Now let's take it one step further to give an example, and I've kind of already drawn on this, okay? If we want to see where this might come to play, we might think of the relationship between anthropology, ethnic and feminist studies, and indigenous studies. And not to say that this is a one-to-one mapping. It's not that anthropology is hegemonic knowledge production only. But again, this is what I'm doing with these little kind of bar charts. I hope it makes sense here. Suggesting that largely anthropology is invested in hegemonic activity. There is some counter-hegemonic activity within this realm. And there's also potentially some ahegemonic knowledge production, but relatively speaking, it's primarily hegemonic. In ethnic and feminist studies, a lot of the work is generally related to approaching and reforming or even opposing the work of the hegemon. And so there is a lot of work that is counter-hegemonic within ethnic and feminist studies. There's also a substantial amount, or the humanities side, that is ahegemonic. And then if we think of indigenous studies, so much of it is really driven by needs of communities in specific places and times. The goal is to be ahegemonic, but because it's also reliant on institutions and relationships to others, it cannot be entirely ahegemonic. That's kind of a framing of how I'd like to get at different forms of knowledge production that are related to each other, but not because we're attempting to subsume one into the other. And it's not to place a value judgment on them, to say that indigenous studies is good, anthropology is bad, in completely blanket terms, but to recognize the forms of relationships and overlaps between them. What I want to suggest is that there's a way to make use of the overlap. And for this, I'm drawing from the work of Chela Sandoval and her conceptualization of a differential consciousness. That if we can find ways, again, not to subsume one realm into the other, but to create dialogues that allow for trans-epistemic conversations, then we're moving into a place in which we can value each of them on their own terms and find also new ways for feeding the imagination and getting us outside of the constraints of any one realm. This is probably very abstract, so let's see if we can jump to an example. And for this, I turn to some work that I've been doing in Yucatan, basically since graduate school, so for about 20 years now. None of it happens without a colleague of mine, Pedro Pablo Chupech, who's a Mayan elder in the city or the town of Popola, which is just outside of Valladolid in rural Yucatan. Pedro Pablo was a bilingual instructor for most of his career. He was teaching within the Mexican school system, and he was focused on Yucatec, Mayan, and Spanish bilingualism. His big concern over his career was that it was being treated in many of the same ways that we treat Spanish in the United States. That Yucatec was what got students into school, and then once they got into school, they were taught Spanish, and it was essentially a bridge, and that was it. And Pedro Pablo was much more interested in preserving Yucatec literacy, and that's how our kind of intellectual trajectories combined, and we decided we would start working together. That's just the stairways up to his home. Across the street, we worked collaboratively to construct a kind of an educational center in Popola for the local community. That's what it looks like from the outside. He was very interested in preserving the traditional architecture. And in it, we've been holding workshops. At first, it was annually. It's become much less frequent over time, but I'm still planning on going down this summer, for example, if COVID allows. But here you can see what we're doing is we're bringing the notion of Yucatec literacy into contact with ancient forms of cultural expression, like hieroglyphic writing, and finding ways in which they can be mutually productive in the interests of local community members, not because we want to now train them to become academics, but because we want to give them the opportunity to explore these on their own terms. So we hold these workshops, usually a lot of kids, but there are actually participants from all ages who join us. What it's done is it's given us the opportunity to think through pedagogy of these materials, but also to explore the archive of potential documents to use in our own work. And for a long time, Pedro Pablo and I have been talking about looking at one document in particular. We've recently taken that up. We started to look at the book of Chilambalam of Chumayel. The books of Chilambalam are well known. Again, there are a whole bunch of manuscripts that are again written in the Latin alphabet, but in the Yucatec language. They show up at a whole bunch of sites across Yucatan. The one in particular that we're focused on, though, it comes from the city of Chumayel, the town of Chumayel. And we focused in on one specific portion of it, has to do with creation text. Oh, sorry, those are a bunch of the versions of books of Chilambalam that are out there. We're focusing on the first one, the Chumayel. We're starting with this section that really just says, Ichil Buluk Ahau. It's talking about in the time of 11 Ahau, which is a date. It's giving us the commencement of a time period. And here, there's captured a creation narrative. What we wanted to do is, of course, look back at what others have done. There are a lot of scholars who have done translations of this. The most famous or the most well-known in English is by Ralph Royce. The one that Pedro Pablo himself was familiar with in Spanish is by Mediz Bolio. So we're looking at what they have done, but we're focusing on the Yucatec text itself to see how they arrive at their translations and to explore what other translations might occur to us. The reason I was involved at all is just because there are orthographies from the 16th century in how folks wrote the language that I have some familiarity with and that Pedro Pablo wasn't. And so we work together in ways that hopefully mitigate the forms of the records themselves. And what we find when we get to this text, this creation narrative, it starts off with a battle. It starts off with this confrontation between two figures. And it's ambiguous how they're figures, but it's Oxlajuun Tiku and Bolon Tiku, which has been translated as Oxlajuun is 13, and Kuh is often translated as God. We'll get to that in a minute. So 13 of God or 13 gods, or there's a lot of ways in which people work with it. Oxlajuun Tiku and Bolon Tiku is similar, but with Bolon as 9. So these two figures, who are also multiply constituted in some way, are engaged in this battle. This overall section that we're going to be looking at is followed by another thing that is a characteristic trope across Mesoamerica, and that is the setting up of the cosmic trees in the 4 directions And so we know that this is a cosmic narrative for a lot of contextual reasons. What's hard is some of the language within this specific passage that we're addressing. So what we did was we started off and we had no real problems with the translations as we read the text and as others have. And so it starts off with the description of Bolontiku actually capturing Oxlahuntiku. He captures him and then he basically beats the guy up. It says his head was broken, he was buffeted in the face, he was spit upon, they threw him on his back to carry him away. So we know that there's this battle, we know that there's a defeat of one by the other, and then we get to this phrase that has given folks a whole lot of trouble. Kaish kolabi ukangel yetel uchol sabak. What does that mean? Folks have basically focused on a couple of parts from this sentence. Kolabi, the verb itself, kangel, there's a noun of, and we'll get to what it may be in a minute, and then sabak. The interpretations from Roy's and Medisbolio are very different and they're very interesting. Roy's says that kolabi can be interpreted as despoiled, and then he translates kangel as insignia and sabak as smut. This is pretty hard to parse, but it actually, you can see if you go back to his translations and his footnotes, you can see what he's doing here. Kangel is a representation of some kind of serpent, a dragon of some sort, but it also shows up in iconography as something that people wear on themselves as an emblem, and so as an insignia in Roy's interpretation. What he's suggesting is that Oxlahuntiko was wearing his insignia of a kangel, and that's what was ripped away from him when he was defeated. The translation of sabak as smut, sabak is a black soot, and so we have representations of artists and elite figures who would paint themselves with this soot. And so what Royce is arguing is that this is a way in which this figure had his paint smeared or destroyed in his defeat. And in that way, it's all a consistent story of Oxlahuntiku's defeat. And Medisbolio goes on with the stealing of the serpent of life, and then he has a really challenging connection between the tail of a rattlesnake and sabak. But basically what they're doing is they're drawing from comparisons to ancient cultural production and then making the links to have it all be consistent in the end. When Pedro Pablo and I started thinking about this, we went back also to classic period inscriptions, cultural production, representations. And one of the things that we thought was that there was a way in which the sentence seemed to be describing a process that we see represented variously in ancient Mayan art. And here, one of the most famous is the version from Yaxchilan, Lentil 25. You can see again a little bit better if we pull out the drawing. The representation here is of a figure who is doing a conjuring. We go up to the glyph, we see it's Utsak Ukawilil. This is a conjuring of an ancestor. What this woman is doing, and you can tell from other scenes, is that she lets blood in by pulling a rope through her tongue. That blood drips onto paper, which is then placed in a bowl. That bowl the paper in that bowl is lit on fire, and out of it comes smoke. The idea is that this smoke then can generate visions, and out of that vision, we see ancestors. So that in some ways, what we're seeing here, as Pedro Pablo and I were discussing this, is that this is kolabi, the extraction or the pulling out of a serpent from a sooty portal. So that Uhol Sabak is the portal of black soot. And so when you're burning paper here, then you'll have a black soot out of which smoke arises, that you're pulling essentially this ancestor out of this portal. And what we're doing now is we're finding a way in which we're connecting a translation of this Yucatec text to an image that we see in ancient Maya art. And then when we do that, what we find is that there's even further connection to the rest of the passage. Yes, there's this battle, there's this beating up, but then there's this, what happens is that the body of Oxlahuntitcu is left on the ground, and there is essentially a conjuring or a pulling out of its soul, which we see in actual Mayan iconography as well. If we go to the classic Maya site of Copan and we move over to Temple 22, we find a representation of what's referred to as a cosmogram. Like the sarcophagus lid of Palenque, you have a representation of the underworld here. You can see the skulls. You have the middle realm by these people, and then they hold up the sky. So the three realms of the cosmos. What they're showing as the sky, though, is a representation of the Milky Way, and it's this great celestial dragon. You can see that it's marked with these star icons, with ek icons, and so it's telling us this is the starry part of the night sky. What we're seeing then is that there's a representation that matches the pulling of the soul out of Oxlahuntitcu and turning it into the Milky Way, which is represented in the sky. Now you have full embodied representation of the cosmos. And one of the reasons that's fun and exciting is when we get back to the text, it follows extremely well with what comes afterwards. After the pulling of the serpent out of this body, there's another figure who comes along, Bolon Sakab. That's this figure down here. Oops, sorry. Yash Bolon Sakab. And what he does is he grabs the plants and the souls of the seeds, right? There's a phrase here. Upuksikal puyem sikil. He's not grabbing the seeds themselves. He's taking the souls of the seeds and he grabs them, he wraps them up, and he takes them to the 13th level of the sky. He takes them into this Milky Way for basically placement there to set up the possibility of agriculture in the future. And one of the really fun aspects here that I, again, talk about in the other article where I'm dealing with creation narratives, is that a lot of this hinges on how you interpret one term. This phrase, or this noun here, ibnel. It's very straightforward in Yucatec Maya as womb, as the womb of a woman. But Roy's and others have kind of cut off the suffix and just focused on ib, which gives it the representation of a seed, of beings. And so if you translate this as seeds, you get one interpretation. If you recognize that they're pulling the fertility of the seeds from the cosmic womb, you get a very different interpretation. And so if we go with the latter, what we end up with is a representation of the cosmos in which what's precious, the soul of the seeds, is brought up into the Milky Way, and then it comes down with the rains brought down by the chaks, so that you have this cosmology of agricultural fertility that's based on the cosmos itself. And that gets us to the role of the Kuhulahau in this whole storyline, which is to perform the same kind of activity relative to the Kuh in his or her environment. This representation from Yaxchilan, again, gives us the Kuhulahau, who's doing the same action, the same what we used to call the fish in hand glyph verb, utsak, in order to engage with his environment. And what we understand by his environment is a personified one. We get that from the word Kuhulahau itself, which is often translated as ruler, but we find that that's really a poor translation of it. Instead, when we break it down into pieces, we find that it's made up of Kuh, which is this notion of indigenous power. It's not God in the Indo-European sense, but it often gets translated as that. Instead, it's thought of as an indigenous power, and we're saying that Kuhul means related to in indigenous power, and then Ahau is the main term here, is the Ah is the agentive, so it's telling us the person who speaks forcefully. In this sense, the Kuhulahau is the person who speaks forcefully with the powers of the environment, the powers that exist around us. It's giving us a very different notion for leadership than somebody who's simply sitting at the top of a hierarchy and dictating. Instead, it's the leader who negotiates with the environment on the community's behalf. And so when we bring all these things together and we find again that there is a representation of maize and there is a representation of conjuring that Khan Balam is engaged in this central tablet, and that the tablet isn't just about the terrestrial realm. It is also related to the other two structures, which reference the celestial realm and the underworld. We're seeing that the notion of agriculture and the relationship between the kuhulahau and agriculture is a central one. It's not one in which there's a meaningful life that exists for the kuhulahau and the noble families in one space, and agriculture is relegated to the periphery. Instead, agriculture is central to the notion of leadership itself. And so I'm basically hoping to conclude with the notion that when we think about different forms of agriculture, and we think about projects, even extremely local ones, like regenerative agriculture here in the Central Coast area, that this is something that does tie together many of the themes that come from Indigenous Mesoamerica in relationship to agriculture. It's not something that's simply extractive. It's not something in which we impose as humanity our will on a landscape. It's one in which there is a symbiotic and a mutually beneficial relationship, but that we can't just stop there when we're thinking about regenerative agriculture. We also have to think about the people who are doing the work in the fields of agricultural production in whatever form it takes. And so that if we really draw inspiration from ancient Mesoamerica, recognize that there was an interruption of an intellectual trajectory of thought around agriculture, what we can do is we can go back and we can find ways to reintegrate leadership in terms of political and community organization, reintegrate that leadership with the sustenance of our livelihoods, our everyday lives, and the different forms of institutions that we live in on a daily basis. So I hope that came together in some kind of coherent way, and I appreciate any questions you may have around that.
I thought it came around full circle quite nicely, so thank you so much for that. It was really fascinating. So if anybody has any questions, you can send me a message in the chat and we can make you participant so you can, or panelists, so you can pose the question yourself, or feel free to type those questions into the Q&A box. Oh, okay. Vanilde says, where is your research taking you next?
That is a great question, Neil. Thank you for that. So I'm currently working on, I'm finishing up that book that's coming out on Mayan astronomy. The original motivation there wasn't simply to do Mayan astronomy. When I moved into this area way back, leaving mechanical engineering, it was an attempt to understand Mesoamerican thoughts, conceptualizations of science on a much broader level. And so that's what I've been working on. That's what I'm hoping to explore more. What do we mean by science in modern society? What did they mean by science? What does it tell us about how we use science and how it gets integrated into society? One of the things that concerns me, for example, is that distinction, right? That a lot of agriculture today is driven by profit without much oversight. Can we say the same thing about science? And what does that do if we just allow science to generate products for us to consume, but there isn't really oversight in terms of how it's impacting the world that we live in? Those are the kinds of things that I think we can draw inspiration from other cultures in order to explore alternatives, in order to imagine alternatives.
Okay, and then please do share your questions, but I have one in the meantime. I was really interested in this idea of the failure of imagination in how we are seeking understanding of the past and present. But I thought it was kind of interesting in contrast to using tools like LiDAR or satellite imagery that almost feel like the opposite of imagination. They're very concrete, delineated information. And I wondered how you're thinking about those two things together and how that produces different kinds of knowledge for us.
That's a brilliant question. And I think it really gets to the heart of it, is that what I'm saying is that when we're talking about knowledge production, especially when we're talking about knowledge production relative to the ancient Maya, we often get so fascinated with the technology, with what we can do with the technology, that that becomes the end game and not what we're actually representing. So what are our obligations? What are our responsibilities to the people we're investigating? And what are, how are we being driven simply by coming up with new technology to ask these questions, not spending the time on the ethics around what we are representing? And to me, that's one of the problems that starts this whole thing, is that it's easy to come up with new tech. Well, it's not easy. It's easier to come up with new techniques and then to tell the same story than to use those techniques to help you push the boundaries and come up with alternative stories. Then maybe you're getting us closer to something that is a valid representation. But at this point, we don't really know, because we don't have that sense of where we're drawing these other interpretations from. One of the things that worries me is that especially as academics, we get comfortable with the banal, right? It's easy for us to say the exotic Maya, the mysterious Maya, and then show something that kind of reinscribes that interpretation of them. How do we get past that? And isn't it worthwhile for us to get past that?
I think we're all, oh, nope, there is one, just popped up. Okay, Veronica asks, Dr. Aldana, how has an engagement or praxis of differential consciousness assisted your transnational research engagements, considering a trilingual, community-oriented, and multicultural context?
That's a brilliant question, and I'm most indebted in so many ways to Chela Sandoval and my conversations with her around differential consciousness. This notion that we don't move within any one single space, and again, this is where I'm trying to draw these forms of knowledge production. These spaces that we're thinking within can be boundaries, and we want to get outside of them. So the notion is that differential consciousness allows us to inhabit the different spaces, but to at the same time be able to move out of them in a way that sees the connections without subsuming one under the other, without saying, okay, ahegemonic knowledge is useful because it can help us better perform or produce new stuff that is hegemonic. It's not that. It's recognizing the value of each on its own terms and then looking for potential uses of it. And I think that what I'm trying to do with that example is show that the productivity of my work with Pedro Pablo Chupech is not that now I can take what we've produced and then bring it to the United States and publish it. Instead, it's that there is a value for his community there, which is primary. That's what we're working on. If there are ways in which that produces material that can be brought over and have utilities in other places, he knows I give these talks. He knows that I'm referencing it. That's useful, and it can be useful for us, but it's not the primary motivation, and it's not to constrain what comes out of those discussions or those conversations. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So it looks like we're exactly on time. And so thank you so much for joining us today and sharing all of those, really interesting. Oh, wait, somebody has a hand up. As soon as then maybe never mind. I lost it. Okay, sorry. Thank you again, everybody, for making time to join us today. It's we know it's a busy time of the quarter, and we're really excited to continue this lecture series later in the summer. Those dates will be announced later, and we'll try to keep everybody in the loop. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.